right, welcome everyone. We're going to get going. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. I'm Ian Powell, and I'll be hosting today's Data Integrity and AI Forum. This session is set up as a conversation, and we have an incredible panel who will be sharing their knowledge and experience on a number of critical agentic enterprise topics, and we've got plenty of time for you to engage and discuss with the panel too. In our experience, the most useful takeaways come out of these sessions are revealed in the room. So please join in the discussion, share challenges, share opportunities that you see inside your organization. A few bits of housekeeping before we get going. We're running on Goldcast today, and we'll be inviting people on stage to share their views throughout. So you'll need your camera and you'll need your microphone enabled to do that. If you're in Chrome and you weren't prompted when you joined, please click the little camera icon in your browser bar. If you switch permissions to allow and hit refresh, that should hopefully get you sorted. Please type in the chat if you've got any problems, and we will try to help you out in the background. And don't worry, we're not going to put anyone on the spot and jump you straight onto stage, but it will make it a lot smoother for everyone when you do have something to share or ask. Okay, all right. Our topic for today is AI stress testing data governance. And it's becoming increasingly common when I speak to organizations that AI has highlighted more than ever the need for well-governed and accurate data. And it's pushing it right to the top of both the business and IT strategic initiatives. In terms of what to expect from today, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes or so walking through some key findings from the 2026 State of Data Integrity and AI Readiness research, and then we'll go into a panel discussion with some interactive polls for you guys. And the back end of the session is open for you all to share what you're seeing, challenge what the panel says, and ask the questions that really matter to you guys. The goal is simply to have a open, honest conversation about what's happening in the ecosystem and how to make sense of the world in an agentic enterprise. To give our conversation some grounding, I wanted to share a few findings from the Data Integrity and AI Readiness report. That is a mouthful. I'll keep getting that right, hopefully. This report was produced in partnership with Drexel University's LeBow College of Business. And the research is based on over 500 data and analytics leaders across a wide range of industries and organization sizes. The main purpose is simply to present an independent and agnostic view of what data leaders are actually experiencing right now and their challenges of adopting AI. And AI is now the principal driver of all data strategy. Specifically, 52% of organizations say that AI is now the primary influence on how their data programs are designed, funded, and prioritized. That's a massive shift from the kind of AI science experiment that we saw a couple of years ago to foundational data strategy today. And these data programs that used to be built around reporting and analytics are now being rebuilt with AI at the core. The necessity for AI readiness and agility raises the bar, therefore, for everything underneath: data quality, data governance, and integration. And here's where it gets really interesting. I'm sure you'll find it as interesting and surprising as I did that 87% of data leaders describe their organization as AI ready. Yet nearly half of those very same respondents in the very same survey also cited data readiness, skill gaps, and infrastructure as their biggest barriers to AI success. So that's a significant gap between confidence and reality. And in my opinion, that goes a long way to explaining why so many AI projects start with real momentum and then stall just before they reach production. And no doubt that's a topic that our panel will pick up later. The pressure, though, isn't just internal. Leaders are being asked to show how AI return on investment is happening quicker and quicker, with many expecting results inside the first year. with the complexity of having to do this while the foundational work of data readiness, skills development, and operating model design is still underway. And the disparity that we see between AI expectation and AI capability is where so many AI projects appear to disappoint or fail. So before we get into the exciting panel production, the survey points to three consistent themes. AI confidence is outpacing actual readiness and by a significant margin. Data quality is no longer a technical metric. It's become a business critical risk. And then context, skills, and execution are what determines who actually succeeds with AI. And what the research makes clear is that the underlying enabler for all three of these themes is data governance, not as a compliance or tick box exercise, but as a genuine strategic foundation. And that's really what today is all about. So with that, please let me introduce our wonderful panel. The incredible experience of our three panelists covers data governance from almost every angle. We've got coaching covered, practitioner, consulting, and first, Nicola brings deep expertise in governance frameworks and how they evolve in her practice as the data governance coach. Welcome, Nicola. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself.
Oops, sorry. Thanks, Ian. Trying to get the mute off. It's wonderful to be here. I am really lucky that my job just involves helping people develop capability to be successful at data governance, and so I love doing sessions like this because I get to try and share both my own experience and what I'm seeing in my clients, but also stop people making mistakes that I'm seeing and making. It's great if we can help people avoid those.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you, Nicola. I'm delighted that you're here. Kevin, who's the VP of Data Analytics at Lake Michigan Credit Union, brings that frontline, real-world perspective that we all value so much. Thank you so much for joining us, Kevin. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hey, thanks, Ian. Yeah, good morning. Well, I've been doing data and analytics and other work in that domain and space for probably over 25 years with time spent in financial services, healthcare, automotive, and other manufacturing, and been really spending a lot of time focusing on helping to build trusted data foundations for these organizations to really support better decisions and strong governance at the core of that with great data quality. And now lately, it's really been turning to responsible AI. How do we make sure AI is making those good decisions?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your insight. And then David, who leads the global services business here and is SVP at Precisely. David obviously brings a broader range of what we're seeing across organizations globally. David, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ian. David Woods. I have an interesting career in that I spent the beginning part of my career, I'd say a little over a decade or so, running global data and analytics for Johnson & Johnson. So I've been on kind of Kevin's side of the house there. And for the past 2 decades, I've been helping our customers navigate how to best, optimize and expand their programs. And I can tell you, in the 3 decades that I've been in this space, I know Kevin's been in this space almost the same amount of time. Governance has never been more important than it is right now with the advent of AI, and particularly agentic AI. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation and the discussion today.
Couldn't agree more. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all. Really looking forward to this. Before we get into the data, let's hear from the room, shall we? Madison, if all right, can we launch our first poll, please? All righty. So, has your data governance program improved trust in your data? So we're looking quite simply for a yes or no, very binary at this stage. There might be a somewhat, or maybe we don't have a formal governance program. While you guys are locking in your answers there, let me kind of run through a little bit of what the research showed from the study. Kind of unsurprisingly, similar to what we see on the screen at the minute, one of the strongest signals in the research is that the role of data governance in establishing trust, it clearly showed that organizations with governance programs consistently report higher trust and better AI outcomes, right? However, that drops to pretty much a coin toss without any data governance program.
Right.
So if you're making business decisions or training models on data that only half the organization trusts, that's a real problem, right? So kind of interested to the panel, first question, Nicola, if I go to you, does that figure surprise you? And why do you think organizations without governance plateau on trust so quickly?
Oh, big question. I'm actually really surprised that not more than 71% of people thought they were going to trust their data because they've done data governance. So
Right.
I'm a bit worried that perhaps they're not doing data governance properly or are really understanding what it is, which is a bit scary. And again, equally, I loved your the coin toss. That's exactly what the 50% is. If you haven't got data governance, you're always going to have some experts in the organization who might go, "Ooh, I'm going to check that data first today. It doesn't look quite right." And they can't tell you what it is, but they have this gut feel. But what about the people who are new to the job, who aren't experienced, or they're just junior and they're told you get this set of data and you do this with it, and they don't think about it? I think, it's very naive to think that you can get sustainable data quality without data governance, in my experience.
Fascinating, thank you. And Kevin, would you say that aligns with your experience? I mean, I guess, was there a time where it started to feel that there was a trust shift one way or another?
Yeah, and I think it does align with a lot of my experience, right? As we think about organizations that really trust their data, that have data governance programs, it's those that have actually kind of implemented that into their, I'll say, operating model and ways of working, right? It's not just something that's documented. It's not just something that sits on a page, but it's got true ownership to it. And it's embedded in their day-to-day kind of decision-making. And so when we see that, and when we actually do that, we actually start to really trust the data that comes in those organizations.
Yeah, interesting. Not something that sits on a page, right? It's a lot of conversations that are taking the shift from a kind of compliance-driven governance program to now a business-driven one. Very interesting that you raised that. And Dave, I guess you're seeing so many conversations in the inception, I suppose, of some of these AI initiatives. Is trust usually the driver for starting a governance program like this?
Yeah, I mean, you and Kevin are really right. And, it has evolved. It used to be very compliance driven, and I would say somewhat industry specific as well. So financial services, healthcare, any regulated environment felt that trust pressure first. But that's really changed, particularly over the past 2 to 3 years. What we're seeing now is trust has really become kind of the universal requirement for governance, and AI is only accelerating that because, as you guys know, we feed a model bad or uncontextualized data, the outputs erode trust really fast. So governance has really gone from a kind of a compliance thing to something every business needs if they want their data to actually work for them.
Yeah, totally agree. Really interesting. And I'm going to bring some of the audience in, if that's okay. You can see there's a ticker running across the screen to raise your hand and join the discussion. I'd love to know, does this match what you guys are seeing? Does anyone in the audience have a different story to the panelists? Please let us know. Do we have any hand raisers? Okay, none at the minute, but please do think about it, and we'll be trying to bring the audience into these conversations. Oh, I think I see one. Okay, yeah, okay, exactly the same. Interesting. So, yeah, look, if you see topics and you want to raise your hand, please do so, because it would be great to get that participation back and forward. Yeah, as the team were speaking then, I was thinking about, where are we seeing where governance hasn't or has moved that needle in trust in the organization. And I'm certainly interested if there's an inflection point or critical mass that seems to happen. I'd love to hear that from people that might be on the call. So we're going to move on. If we look at that governance readiness gap that we just touched on, there's another thing that really stood out from the research. And that is that 83% of organizations say they have some form of data governance in place, right? But that very same group also flags that data readiness is a key barrier to AI success. So when you think about that, they've got data governance in place, yet still struggling to scale AI because of data readiness, right? Kind of make it make sense. And I guess that leads us to the inevitable question of whether all data governance is created equal, or is the effectiveness of that program the limiting factor when it comes to AI? So we're going to launch another poll now, and I'd love to understand, what is the biggest barrier to effective data governance in your organization? And you're going to see a few options jump out at you. You're going to see data quality. Obviously, the underlying data is the challenge that you see. Ownership and accountability. Who's responsible for what parts within the organization? Skills and resources. Complexity, maybe. Too many systems, too many stakeholders involved in that process. Or maybe it's simply business alignment. So data quality, ownership and accountability, skills and resources, complexity, and business alignment. Very interesting. I'm seeing lack of ownership, accountability becoming a bit of a theme here. David, I'm going to pull you into this conversation if okay. If you had to name one thing that organizations consistently underestimate when they launch a governance program, what do you think it would be?
Yeah, it's really the alignment to me between strategy and the governance program itself. So organizations that tend to treat them as separate work streams really can't articulate the value and point to outcomes where governance was an accelerator and an enabler for the successes or any of the value. Even our own research, Ian, I know you're familiar with it as well, right? We showed that organizations that have both a data strategy and governance in place are twice as likely to expect positive ROI within the first 6 to 12 months, right? Mm-hmm. And the laggards aren't failing because they don't care. They're often doing governance in isolation from a broader data strategy. So the moment those two things connect, that's where you see the trust scores and the business results that follow as part of that.
Yeah, interesting. Nicola, would you kind of agree with that? Do you see that the main barriers organizations struggle? Do you see other themes?
Yeah, and I think, I couldn't help myself voting, even though I knew this was coming. But it is very much what David was saying. I think, for whatever reason, an organization starts doing data governance, they tend to do it either because it's regulatory or somebody thought it was a good idea, and they're not thinking that big picture. So it is that business alignment. And I was having a coaching call with a client not long before this, and she's shown me some slides that she's done. And one of the benefits of data governance was understanding our data better. And I went, yes, so what? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, yes, you will, but that's not actually what your business people want to hear. What will help them if they understand the data? So it is this making it back to the business alignment. What business problems will you solve? What business value will you deliver? I think is really important.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, unlike, very similar, I suppose, to AI itself. The context is so important in the discussion. Kevin, I'm fascinated. You're obviously making this change and navigating it right now within your organization. In your view, what does that business alignment actually mean in practice when you try and get that buy-in and that accountability?
Yeah, to definitely continue to kind of pull that thread that Nicola talked about, right, around business alignment, and having it kind of from the top down is super important, right? Helping to get alignment all the way at the top, push that into the organization, helping the organization understand what it will look like in a year or 2 years when this is under governance and under this journey. Hopefully there's quicker change, right, than that. Maybe it's 3 months, 6 months, but ultimately it's telling them the why, right? Like, when this data is clean, what is that going to allow you to do? What kind of decisions can you actually make faster? How much time do you spend looking at a report and then another report and trying to understand why these numbers don't match, and spend more time analyzing data than making decisions on data? And that's that big shift and change. When you get that alignment, you drive it from the top down, you push it into that lack of ownership and accountability into that organization to real leaders in the organization that have influence over it. That's gaining that alignment and driving that change.
Yeah, interesting. It feels like certainly the views of the panel there mirroring what we've seen in the poll study. I'm interested, those in the audience, does it surprise you? I've seen some comments around that it's a combination of things. Is there something that is missing, or anything that anyone would like to add to that?
And Ian, while we're kind of waiting there, maybe one of the things, Kevin, I think is important to kind of dovetail on what Nicola said, and you mentioned at the beginning, was embedding in the operating model, right? So, as the three of us know, one of the barriers where your governance program, your governance team tend to be stood up as a bit of an adjunct, right? And you either had to force, kind of our business users and consumers of, better data standards, better data quality to come to us, or we had to kind of push it onto them. And I know one of the things that's changed quite a bit, with the advent of MCP servers and the ability to kind of expose some of that great content that our teams put together, is that we can meet kind of our business users where they are, right, Kevin? And I know, when you talked about operating model, and, I know a lot of your strategy is to embed governance, if you will, almost tacitly or natively into the applications and the processes that, your business users are doing on a day-to-day basis, right? Not make it a separate activity, correct?
100%, Dave. You have to work at embedding it into, I'll say, the core of your organization, and that might be through an application, that might be through processes, but ultimately, if you don't figure out how to embed it in there, it's always going to feel like a bolt-on and an afterthought.
Right.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, all right. So as we think about that in the context of this maturity curve that you guys were just kind of discussing, how would we think about, launching poll number 3, I think now, how would we describe our organization's governance maturity today? So we've got scalable and delivering. I'll be surprised if there's many of these, but replicable processes, measurable value, evolving, which we've got some governance in place, but we're still building towards that scale and I suppose the consistent value. We see some early stage, right, determining the right approach, and not started at all yet. Very interested to see some established. Love to hear from some of those in the established bucket. I think that'll be really interesting to hear from. As we go through, kind of as you guys are filling out the poll, if we look at some of the results from the research, it found some really interesting trends, right? And one of which was that organizations seem to cluster into 4 distinct profiles. And Dave actually mentioned a couple of them earlier. And they're typically based on 2 factors, whether they had a clear data strategy and whether they had a formal governance program in place. And we see these categories fall into innovators, with a clear strategy and mature governance model, right? Using data strategically, not just managing it day to day. The second group of planners, governance foundations in place, but not yet connected to that broader data strategy, exactly what the panel were talking about earlier, that accountability. And then experimenters, where we've got a clear strategy and ambition, but the governance hasn't kept pace with that, right? So you're moving really fast without guardrails. I certainly see a lot of that in my discussion. And then the laggards that Dave mentioned earlier, without necessarily a clear strategy or governance program. And we see these pockets of maybe innovation or slowdowns because of that. And when we think about that, that the highest performing organizations aren't treating strategy and governance as separate work streams, they're running together. And the trust scores related to that from the survey, just elaborate that point. So we see 71% high trust scores in that innovation category, 61% in those planners, experimenters at 40, and laggards at 0, right? Probably unsurprising to see the gradient, but the extremism of it, I found really interesting when looking at the combination of 2. In that context, David, from your perspective, do these 4 profiles match what you're seeing in client engagements? Are there trends that tend to show up most when organizations ask for help?
Yeah, I mean, they tend to match, but it's kind of like, it's a self-definition to a certain extent of where you are. And I think the interesting thing is that the goalposts have moved, right? So, and this is kind of baked into the research, but more importantly, the research and the results that we got, but my customer conversations. And Ian, as you know, I speak to, 7 to 8, CDO level customers a week, right? And so, from where we were probably 2 years ago, as kind of people build up programs, got some scale, mainly focused again on kind of regulatory compliance type things, some business process execution, and then largely focused more on analytics and data-driven decision making. Now that's changed, right? So that's why I think you see some of the dichotomy in the results, right? Because they built these programs, they've had some success, they felt like they were tied to business strategies. Now the business strategies are flipped on their head with AI. Right. And quite frankly, they're somewhat opaque right now, too. They're not as defined as they were. It's a lot of, what we thought we knew 3 months ago is changing now because of AI. So now, people are starting to realize like, hey, my data was ready. I was in pretty good shape from a governance perspective. But now from an agentic AI perspective, where I really need to provide a high level of context, and any bad data is going to drive some pretty significant in potentially negative results with the outputs of the models that we're putting together. I think you'll almost see that switch, right, if you had it as a net new type view. And that's the main thing I'm seeing. And it's always been that way. It's just the goalposts always move from a governance perspective, but the goalposts are moving really, really fast over the past 12 months.
Yeah, so and the risk and upside is also dramatically more extreme.
It's dramatically more extreme. Yep.
The coin toss that I alluded to earlier, if you haven't got that governance, it almost feels like luck one way or the other. Kevin, these profiles on the screen, I'd be interested if they resonate with you, and maybe a bit of a cheeky question. I'd be fascinated to see where you see LMCU on this grid, and maybe share some insight on that.
Yeah, and it resonates, but a little bit self-serving, and maybe I'd like to think more highly of the program that we've been driving and pushing, but definitely feel like we're in the innovator space. And so what I'd say is that data strategy here, right, isn't just the technical components or pieces. It's more than that, right? And those organizations that really dig into their data strategy and really align that more to their business strategy, and understanding the data that enables that strategy and putting good governance around that information and data. If you've got a strategy to grow your customer base and you're trying to hit that mark, do you really have the governance around that data that's really helping you understand your customer across all of his different segments, or don't you? And do you have owners tied to that? And if you do, and you put good governance around that, you're really going to start to accelerate. And the pace at which technology is changing and technology is enabling us to move faster, you need to make sure the data that you're feeding that thing is good quality data. And if you don't, you're going to start making poor decisions. So without that business alignment to your data strategy, and you then tying in good governance practices, it's going to be really tough, I think, for organizations to continue to win.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think, Nicola, your experience would be really interesting here, kind of coaching customers all the time around, governance and their strategy. Can it succeed without a clear data strategy? Is that possible? What are you doing?
I think this is, looking at the numbers and listening to David and Kevin talk, is really making me reflect not just on like my more recent coaching clients, but in the early days when I was the data governance manager doing this. I think I was probably very much in the planner box. I mean, data strategy hadn't even been heard of as a term when I was first doing data governance. And I think what it gives you, I was quite surprised at how high the percentage came out. But I think from my experience, I would say that those successes are short term if you haven't got a data strategy along with it, because you might be focusing on the wrong things. So what you don't really get is a sustainable, really embedded data governance framework. And I think that, so I wonder if, at the moment, the 61% from the survey is showing that, people are making change. Perhaps they've had data governance for the first time, they solved some business problems and people think that's great. But then I wonder if those organizations are the ones doing AI. I would wonder whether they were maybe not, because they may not have the data ready for their AI, and then the numbers would, perhaps if you ask the same people 6 months' time, would not be quite so high. So, yeah, I think these numbers are really, really fascinating, and they do bear out kind of where I feel.
Yeah, I totally agree. And those on the call, please do, if your mics aren't working, please do type in the chat. We'll be able to see it so we can ask the question. I've kind of got a question on behalf of the group, just out of my own interest, I suppose. We see a really big jump from the laggards to the experimenters in terms of that percent jump, right? And I guess that's just the just go and do something box. Clearly, Nicola, as you just talked about, that jump I guess maybe from the 61% to the 71%, it feels like that's a much harder jump. I'd be interested, what are the gates that we see in jumping from one box to another? Kevin, you mentioned, you were in the planner's box, I suppose, ideally moving to that innovator's box. What are the steps that you feel that need to be taken to call yourself in that innovator's bucket?
I think it's what I talked about earlier, Ian, right? Which is you're not just really focused on a good data governance program that's kind of managing and controlling your data, but you're really focusing in those areas and maybe going deep in them beyond just breadth, right? In areas that you're really trying to drive your business so that you're really tactically focused on there. There's a cost and expense to everything that we decide to govern. And so it's important to govern those things that are most critical to you and your organization. And if you're focused on the things that aren't tied to your business strategy, you're not helping them, like I said earlier, win. And so I think that gap there, right? And you think about that gap, like you go 40% to 61%, it's probably a little bit easier for you to come up with your data strategy when you have good governance, as kind of this chart alludes to, than it is for you to say, I've got a decent data strategy, which may actually be more technical in nature than it is, for me to ultimately start putting governance over top of that. That's a lot harder.
Yeah, it makes sense. And Dave, I suppose a lot of your role when you're speaking to these CDOs is helping guide them and support them in that journey from one category to another. Be interested to see where you see a lot of that effort with Precisely being placed in terms of, is it that laggard to experimenters? Is it the help me understand where a lot of that conversation is happening for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's kind of, it's kind of on the vectors, right? So unless you have, kind of an organization like Kevin's driving, and Kevin's strategy and what he's executing for LMCU is in part based on his knowledge, but in part based on experience, right? Because, Kevin's kind of built these programs through a couple different verticals and a couple different companies, and he understands that it's a convalescence of a strategy that's aligned with business goals, that has measurable outcomes with KPIs or performance measures, and the capabilities you're putting in place from a governance perspective. A lot of times, organizations that I'll talk to are trying to get kind of, improve and expand their data governance programs without considering strategy. And other ones are kind of looking at maybe improving their data strategy without thinking about governance embedded as part of that, right? And Kevin, you alluded to this earlier. I think this is kind of the key point, right? To get to that upper right quadrant, this is where you bring together business and IT together, right? So I can run a business data strategy, somewhat independent of IT to a certain extent, right? And I can move from a laggard to an experimenter from an IT perspective, or if it's a business-driven program, I can go from laggards to planners. The only way you get to that innovator space is to pull those things together, right? So that the capabilities, the technology that supports those capabilities are directly aligned to the things that are making a difference from a business perspective and aligned with overarching strategy. So that's the biggest thing, and that's where we really try to get customers. And I know, Nicole, that's been part of your message for the better part of a decade as well, right?
Oh, very much so. You really shouldn't be doing data governance just without a plan. And I think that's where the data strategy comes in, because you can almost guarantee we'll focus on the wrong things, or we'll do the things that particularly bugged us because of, my own experience, something that had bugged me in a job I'd done before I got into data governance. And I spent a huge amount of time and effort trying to sort out something that not many other people cared about. And I could have actually been using that effort much better if anybody had even thought of data strategies back in those days, and I knew which data was the most important to help move our organization on and achieve its aims and vision.
Yeah. Yeah, not
Yeah,
to kind
very.
of, and Ian, just to kind of like bring Kevin back in here too, to keep it real, maybe for the audience, Kevin and I were able to, we've known each other for a while. We were able to kind of get reinvigorated as he was starting to build the program in LMCU. And I remember, and Kevin, this is very purposeful for you, right? When you brought the team together and you went through kind of the essentially the primer for what you're going to put together from an enterprise data governance perspective, I remember you started with business goals, business priorities, business objectives. There was no talk about data governance. There was no talk about data strategy. It was all overarched the North Star of everything we're doing is driving business outcomes that are important to the organization. And then we cascade from there. I think I say that because that's an important way to start, because you set the tone, Ian, for the program based on that, right? So it's not a let's build it and hopefully it works out. It's more of, this is what we're building it for, and everything we should do should be delivering a capability or a benefit that is a positive outcome on the business.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, and I think a lot of the discussion just now has kind of had AI in its context, but it probably makes sense to shift to AI governance in particular, right? Because that's a question, at least for me, I'm sure for you guys, that is coming up in almost every single conversation that we're having, right? If we launch the next poll, if that's okay, I'd be fascinated from the group how our organizations today are currently approaching the AI governance specifically, right? So extending our existing data governance framework to cover AI. Are we building a separate purpose-built governance AI framework? Is it a hybrid of the both? Or we're working on that approach, or we don't have a roadmap, like we discussed earlier with the laggards. I think this is one of the most interesting, kind of hotly debated topics at the minute, actually. As those votes are catching up, to share a little bit of insight, I suppose, from the survey, from the data leaders, the largest group, 40%, are extending their existing data governance programs into AI, right? And that, it is really interesting, especially in the context that 23% feel it requires a completely separate framework, right? And as I just alluded to, the debate between those two positions is one of the most genuinely interesting conversations that's happening right now. My view openly is it's probably not a pure either or, but I'm really interested in what the panel thinks in regards to kind of the survey results. Nicola, what are clients saying when you're speaking to them today?
So I'm finding a lot of my clients, and I've been at quite a few in-person events the last few weeks. There's an awful lot of data governance teams that are being asked to take on AI governance, and they're finding it really scary. I think there's a lot of reasons why that could be a really good idea, but quite a lot of the people I'm talking to are not being given extra resource. And whilst I think, obviously, we're all data people, we all know that we need good quality data and understand what our data is for our AI to be successful. So I think the data governance people feel comfortable they could do that part of AI governance, but they feel totally at loss about, how do you do the model validation? How do you, check for bias? Because this isn't their skill set. So I think a lot of them feel like they'd rather it was done by them than not at all, or by anybody else, but they're feeling rather perhaps overwhelmed by it at the moment, in my experience.
Yeah, I guess a lot of that depends on the existing trust within the organization of the existing framework, right? Kevin, how are you guys approaching the AI governance internally?
I think a lot of organizations are faced with a council for everything. You've got something there for data privacy, maybe for governance, maybe for risk, maybe for project steering team. And what we're tending to do and drive towards is to do as much as we can to get that into one common council where it makes sense, but making sure you've got the right representation there and making sure that you're asking the right questions kind of in that space around AI. So right, when we're looking at leveraging AI in a particular use case, the question comes up is, does it even make sense to use AI in this capacity? If we decide it does, do we even have the data that's of sufficient quality to allow AI to actually act in that way? And ultimately, lastly, we start to ask the question, of just because we can, should we? And what I mean by that is, does it actually tie to an organization, for us at least, our core values, maybe to our ethics, to the principles, to the way that we want it to show up for our members every day? And so it's important that, we have it and we have governance over AI, but I think that approach of kind of embedding it in and not making it something separate is really important to make sure you're kind of looking at it from all those different angles and vectors to get to the actual decision there.
Got it. And going back to Nicola, do you see those kind of councils, committees, advisory groups, whatever you want to call them, internally for these separate projects? Is that a theme that you see in your discussions as well? And does it work better when they get consolidated, or is it better separating them? Is there a viewpoint that you share on that?
So I would say from working with my clients, lots of councils and boards, steering groups where people have to go, and it's really hard to start a new project in some organizations these days, because no project is just AI or just a system or just data, and then if it's data and it's got personal data in it, if you've got to go to your data privacy people as well, it all gets really, really complicated. And I think that the people that I think do it best is, I've got a global, rather complicated client, and they've worked really hard, and they've collated all the checklists that all these different teams, all these different data disciplines had into one. And then they went through trying to deduplicate, reword things so they could ask something once. And they've also merged some of those councils. So as a business user, as a project manager, you don't waste days trying to find out. I go and see Kevin. Kevin says it's fine from a data point of view. And then he says, but don't forget to ask the AI guys. And I go, who's the AI guys? And I'm running around, and he just, so I think they haven't got AI governance into their checklist and their big thing yet, but that's what they're working on at the moment, because they don't have strong AI governance policies. But they're working on it with a very clear steer that it's going to be aligned and part of their existing way of doing things. Because otherwise it felt like everybody was saying no. Or yes, it's yes from me, but don't forget to go and ask 10 other people. So they're trying to make it as streamlined as possible, but make sure we're covering the key points.
Yeah. I mean, that is, it feels like that coordination. If certainly if AI governance is separate, the coordination between that and the rest of the teams is so important. I'd be interested, Dave, in your view of the considerations that maybe matter most. You have a lot of organizations coming to you, I guess, with some challenges and a lot of complexity. What are the things that you'd really point them to say, hey, this is a priority, or this is where we should focus, or other organizations have had success doing this?
Yeah, it's interesting on this. With AI governance, what I find in most cases is that most organizations, now have some sort of an AI governance construct. Right now, they start it generally with, these are the tools that we're allowed to use or we want to use. These are the tools that are approved. These are the tools that are not approved. And these are, this is the process to evaluate a use case and approve a use case. They generally did not include the data piece of that, right? And that matches what we see from an investment perspective. So over the past 18 months or so, many organizations have spent a lot of what I'll call AI dollars on compute and infrastructure. They haven't really focused on the data. Now that they've got some of these use cases operational, and they found that they are not scalable in production, right? So 9 out of 10 use cases for AI are actually still fail to get into production. And it's because of the data, right? So now you've got this, so how do we kind of pull this stuff together? And I would say, in general, if your existing governance framework has context, lineage, quality rules, that's exactly what AI needs, right? So start there and pull that in there. But the difference is it has to evolve. And Kevin pointed to this, and I love what he said. I think, Kevin, you had said the unique piece we're adding here is the should we, right? And, and with the should we, that includes new considerations and new personas, new roles, right, around ethics, legal, HR, that typically haven't been part of, Nicola, and you and I both know this a lot, part of these traditional, kind of councils, right? So bringing those other personas and those other roles on board is really kind of the trick. So I think, that's kind of the key consideration in that. I think, organizations are right now in this, kind of, growth state and maturity state to see how they're going to get through that.
Yeah, totally agree. I see Mark had a comment regarding kind of AI security and governance working hand in hand as a building block for AI, which totally aligns, I think, with what you guys are saying. We haven't touched too much on the security part. I mean, Kevin, I'd be interested in your view on that in terms of just the underlying framework. That certainly there's skepticism and concern, I suppose, when it comes to AI regarding security. So we'd love to understand how you're tackling that within your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're all concerned about what data, either our personal data or organizational data, that could be used to train some new model or new LLM or whatever it is that's out there, right? And our security teams are partnering with us hand in hand, right? We work together every day. I can't count the number of times I'll walk next door to my CISO's office and we have good conversations around that conversation of should we, right? Which is what Dave teased out from my comment earlier of we can, but should we? Should we use our members' data this way? Should we use our data this way? And so you've got to operationalize it, you've got to embed it, and you got to have those conversations. I think quite often we get caught up as practitioners, kind of focused on the data in our own kind of room where we like to work and play and spend time with our data. But you got to be vulnerable, get out there, ask the questions, ask the tough questions, and realize that even though it may be something you really want to go chase, it may not be the right time. The controls and the security around it may not have evolved to the point that it's appropriate to use right now.
Yeah, interesting. And your should we comment, I think it extends, beyond just the principles of data governance as well. When you think about adoption of AI, it's all about really increasing one of the three things that drives every business, right? It's revenue, it's reducing risk or improving cost effectiveness. And if we're not seeing a direct impact on one of those three, it comes back to the should we, right? Rather than kind of AI washing that we see a lot of. I can see a question actually regarding skills, which is something that came up, in an earlier question or poll as well, which is for the skills side, would the data governance experts be able to manage AI governance, right? The model cards, ATRs, related documentation for impact assessments, etc. Maybe I'll pass that to Nicola and some of the coaching that you're doing and seeing. Do you see that correlation? Do you see that as a challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I helped run a whole masterclass event around integrating AI and data governance, and this is a really real concern. But I also have talked to clients of mine who they kind of want to do data governance. Comes back to this, let's make AI governance rather. We want to make things easier for our business users. We want to make these things work. And if we can embed it into something that already works, then that makes sense. But I think they've got these genuine concerns that you can't just dump AI governance on me without giving me probably extra resources, because nobody ever resources a data governance team as well as we'd like it. So that mean we haven't got team members sitting waiting for extra work, but we probably need tools and we definitely need training. So we need some skills that we don't have. So it could be that we need to perhaps put somebody that has got that skills and knowledge on the team.
Yeah, I think that leads us really neatly actually to our final poll, right? And we've got no survey benchmark to compare against here. What I'd love to understand and we'd love to discuss is your priorities in your own words. So, what is your single top priority for improving AI readiness over the next 12 months? And, a huge number of the themes that we've just discussed, including skills and talent, are relevant here. So, data quality, so getting that foundation right before scaling AI, the governance element, right? Formalizing that ownership, accountability, standards, AI governance, we just talked about, should that be separate? Should be part of it? Skills and talent, as Nicola was just discussing, and the question raised earlier, upskilling the team to operate and be able to govern AI, business alignment, and then technology and infrastructure. Love to see how that pans out. And while we're waiting for that, I'd be really interested, Kevin, based on what you're seeing and those kind of categories, what are the 2 or 3 priorities that you'd tell any data leader in your shoes or in this room what they should kind of focus on first?
I think when you think about AI readiness, it really starts with strengthening your governance. And that really dovetails into all the things that we think about when we think about an enterprise data governance program. But most importantly, it helps us define owners. It helps us define the data we care about most, and it helps us to improve the quality. So a lot of these go hand in hand, and I touched on 2 or 3 items that are on the list there. And when you do that, right, it creates that foundation that drives enough business context for these AI models to be able to consume, to be able to make reliable choices and not hallucinate, right? So not that they never will, but ultimately, if you can't even get to common language, common terminology, you can't trust the quality of your data, you're not going to be able to do that unless you drive that with a data governance program. You're never going to be ready for AI. So, and that's what we're seeing too, right? So we're starting at the top. We've built that kind of governance program. We're pushing it through. We're driving data quality. And quite often what we find, it isn't the quality of data that we're struggling with as much as it is the definitions. How do we define something, and do we all align and agree on that definition? And so if we can't, as an organization, agree what something means, how do we expect AI to understand and know and agree with what we mean? So again, it all starts at that top with governance.
Yeah. The data quality comment you mentioned there, Kevin, I find really interesting because we see more and more kind of the enrichment, I suppose, of data from external sources within organizations, and the governance element, how you tag and record and have control of that data is becoming increasingly important. It's interesting that hasn't been flagged in the voting here, actually. Nicola, you mentioned something just before we jumped to this poll, which I think jumps out here, which was you'd love to, we never quite get the resources we need to invest into the governance programs we'd like to, but is there a gap between kind of what we typically see as being told is important and where that investment actually goes, right? Where do we know the priorities and where does the money get spent? Because they're often two different things, and things are driving investment that might not necessarily get the results that we need.
Oh, I think so. And actually, in the last couple of weeks, I've heard of 2 very senior heads of data governance in the UK. They've actually been made redundant. And what's really scary is that they've been made redundant as part of a focus on AI. But yet the poll here kind of bears out my views strongly, that if we want to be ready for AI and get perhaps return on investment in our AI, we've got to have our governance right. So why are we shrinking our data governance teams and putting money into AI? We should be looking at both together. I think it's an interesting time, and I do know some teams are getting more resource to do it, but I think we really need to work hard. But I also wonder whether perhaps we need to work a bit more pragmatically. I've become increasingly pragmatic the longer I've been doing data governance. In the early days, I would have said, no, all data has to be perfect, otherwise you can't do that. Now, we know how long data governance takes. We've all been doing it a long, long time. You don't start data governance next week and all your data be fixed by Friday. This is a long, long time. So we've got to be pragmatic, because if we say no, they'll just do it anyway without us. So we've got to find pragmatic ways of what's the bare minimum that we can do for perhaps a pilot phase of that data governance AI initiative. Which of the data is the most important to that AI initiative, and what can we do to help? This is where AI is very exciting. I think slightly scary, but very exciting. And we keep hearing the term a human in the loop. But I was on a panel yesterday at an event, and a lady there said she told off for saying that at another event, and said it should be human in the lead. And I think this really sums up what we should be here. AI is really exciting. The things we got the potential to do is amazing, but we don't just say, AI, here's a loud rubbish data, can you sort out what you need and make it right? It can't do that. It needs us to understand that context and then use it appropriately.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I know, Dave, you've got some clear views on that context. I'd love to hear. I mean, once you understand an organization's specific goals and the direction they're trending towards, do you see those priorities shift? Right? What's the conversation that tends to change the roadmap here?
Yeah, and really, it's part of what I talked about before. A lot of it's based on maturity and how progressive and how I would say how baked in AI outcomes are to business strategies, right? So, some people would define AI readiness for data as having the infrastructure in place and the pipelines in place, right? And that indicates to me that they really haven't done a lot of scale production with their programs. Organizations that have found out that the data is the most important thing that's going to drive those outcomes. And this is mimicked by, I know we went through some stats from the LeBow report, but what I found was super interesting in there is that only 31% of organizations had their AI efforts tied to actual KPIs, right? So what that tells me, and can you imagine any other part of our business, Ian? We would have only a third of what we do tied to business KPIs or outcomes, right? I mean, it just dictates that most organizations are in this innovation stage, right? And when you get to this innovation stage and you try to scale into production, you're very, very quickly going to have to tie that to measurable business outcomes. So for me, and I was at a recent customer advisory board, and this was echoed by some of our more mature clients there, the top priority for data leaders here to me would be improve your business semantic layer. Your semantic layer is the keystone that's going to drive AI outcomes and AI success, right? Because AI is able to access very quickly all of this data, right? And we've had this proliferation of getting all our data into these, hyperscaler data platforms, whether it's Snowflake, Databricks, Azure, or whatever. And what organizations are finding is that AI will get all that information. The outcomes are going to be so biased and they're not going to be personalized to what I'm trying to drive decisions based on. So if you can have a contextualized semantic layer that provides that data and exposes that data via our governance program with context, you will leapfrog your competition, and your data program will be a key pillar and underpin to anything that the organization wants to do. So for me, 6 days a week, twice on Sunday, I will be focused on improving and ensuring my semantic layer is not only accessible by business and IT users, but importantly, accessible by agentic agents. That would be where I'd spend 90% of my time in the back half of 2026.
Yeah, really, really, really fascinating. I can tell in the comments that are firing off that violently agree with you, Dave, right? Both around the business context in terms of making that relevant to the C-suite so they can understand it, but also the other elements of making sure the semantic layer and context is relevant. Fascinating. I absolutely love this discussion, guys. Really, really interesting. I want to take a moment to thank everyone that joined on the call. Thank you so much for joining. Really like the engagement on the polls and sharing your views, and any commentary that's been in the chat that we haven't managed to come back to. We will, of course, follow up with you and make sure that we get those questions answered if we haven't done so already. Also, I'd love to thank our wonderful panel. So Nicola, David, Kevin, thank you so much for your insightful discussion. A couple of next steps for those that want to continue the discussion further. Please, you can see a link, I believe, to download the LeBow report, so you can read that in your own time. So please go ahead and do that. And of course, feel free, if you want to hear from experts like Dave and others, feel free to continue the conversation, reach out to the team, or use the link to connect with Precisely, whether that's a data governance strategy conversation, an assessment, or just a follow-up from today to ask some further questions. So a huge thank you, Nicola, Kevin, Dave. Thank you so much for the quality of the conversation today, and everyone that joined us. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.